Everyone, thank you for returning. This is another great panel that we're going to have. This one will be on Japan. How many of us know enough about Japan? I'm not asking this side here, mostly that side, yes. Very good. So I look forward to learning more about it. And we have two speakers, Daiki Nakajima, who is a project manager at JETRO New York. And we have Dave Baeckelandt, Senior Director, Head of Optica Business Development, Cambridge Associates. So thank you so much for letting us know more about Japan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sticking around. I'm sure many of you know Japan. I'm sure you know what's going on in Japan. There's a lot of things going on in Japan. A lot of the times when we start discussions about Japan, it's usually not so much as far as the culture aspect when it comes to business, but it's more so a lot of the financing issues, a lot of what's going on, the healthcare industry, the aging populations, a lot of debates. However, today I just wanted to sort of keep it a little bit more close and personal, and that's why I have Dave with me today. And I wanted to sort of share with you some experiences of exactly what happens when you do create a business in Japan. What happens if your company says, we want to start an operation in Japan? What's the steps to take? There's certainly a lot of hurdles, a lot of challenges, I'm assuming. So that's where sort of I wanted to have this discussion go towards. Of course, if there's questions or if there's anything else, obviously we could go into many other topics, but we'll start from there. So as far as I know, as for anybody that doesn't know JETRO, we are a government organization that promotes bilateral investments. My division, we help U.S. companies we assist U.S. companies in building a presence in Japan. So we do the initial sort of due diligence for a lot of companies that want to expand out into Japan. It just so happens that in Dave's previous work, he's worked with our JETRO Chicago office, and so he's sort of experienced some of our services as well as really doing the due diligence to opening his office to day one of your office. So I guess sort of handing that over to you, the time when you were at William Blair and some of the experiences, I guess we'll just start from there. But, what went through your mind when your company said, we want to look in Japan?
So first of all, thank you very much, Daiki, for having me here, and thank you all for being here. I'll try to make sure that I don't put you to sleep. I'll give you a little background. So I was working for a broker-dealer, a firm called William Blair, based in Chicago, and the bright lights at William Blair decided that they wanted to open up an office in Japan because somebody read something in a newspaper, and it was a little bit more thoughtful than that, but it was kind of along those lines. So what happens when someone says, well, go open up an office in Japan? I mean, the first thing obviously you do is do some research. I was fortunate because I did a little Googling and I stumbled across JETRO being actually in Chicago, just a few blocks from where my office was. So I tramped over there and they had a bunch of guides and directories on how to open up an office in Japan, what the legal ramifications were, and so on and so forth. Also at that time, there was another program involved, FIND, I don't know if you remember that program, which helped enable those of us who were thinking about opening up an office in Japan, what the hurdles were to get there. Now, in fairness, I had already had some experience in Japan. In fact, we were doing business with Japanese entities in the US and also with a few Japanese entities that were in Japan. And I had been a student, an exchange student in Japan prior to that, so I had some idea of what Japan was like. So it wasn't a completely cold experience. But JETRO had a bunch of great materials, and putting together a plan for opening up an office in Japan, of course, is a lot different than implementing it. So, but that was where things started. It was actually started with your Chicago colleagues.
Right.
Yes.
When Japan is kind of known to be a closed country in a sense.
Sure.
We get inquiries. It's sometimes very tough to enter the market, tough to talk to people, tough to talk to the Japanese companies. How did you fare? Given that sometimes you can't go on your own in Japan.
That's a great question. I think we had some of those same issues internally thinking about Japan, and part of the problem, I think, is there's a lot of companies, our company included, don't really think about what it takes to open up an office in the US and then go backward from there and compare it to opening up an office in Japan. It's almost the same process in reverse. So if you can look at what it would take for a company to open up an office in the US in your industry, that's a great starting point to understanding what it might take to open up an office in Japan. And if you do that and you start making the comparisons are actually pretty easy. For example, for our industry, we were a broker-dealer, and we also did research on different companies, and then we'd publish that research. One of the things that was really amazing to us was that all kinds of case studies were available on the JETRO website. Most of the Japanese government organizations include English language translations of laws, regulations, guidance, press releases. The Ministry of Finance, the Bank of Japan also include very extensive spreadsheets, which you can download and actually work through if you want to look at them. And there's so almost every industry has English language material, which I think makes it a lot easier. My personal viewpoint is the difficulties weren't really in opening up an office in Japan, quite frankly. The difficulties were in keeping and making sure that the home office understood some of the challenges that we went through that were normal challenges for opening up an office anywhere.
Did you have to do a lot of translating as well? Because there is a lot of manuals, a lot of applications,
Yes.
corporate applications that are mostly in Japanese, and a lot of times companies do have to find somebody that's capable of understanding it because how strict it also is. If you make one mistake in an application process of corporate registration or even a bank opening up a corporate account and you get rejected, you're practically done.
I think that's a great point. I mean, it always makes sense to hire somebody to help you in any way, shape, or form. We hired multiple people to help us in lots of different ways. If you're a corporation here in the U.S., the logical thing is to reach out to your accounting firms, your attorneys, and see if they have contacts in Japan, because that's a logical extension. If they do, then simply going through that existing network is one nice way to do things. And the same goes for your bank. You want to have a bank, you want to have banking relationships here that are going to translate over into Japan. You want to have some credit history here so that when you rent a location, somebody considers you a viable entity. And you want to make sure that anything that you are looking at is indeed, double checked and triple checked. I mean, one mistake is a sign of a sloppy organization. And that, as you point out, or I think you're hinting at, Daiki, is that if you do make tiny mistakes, unlike maybe Europe or the US, if you do make those tiny mistakes, those will hurt you in terms of image and getting something accomplished there. So just being careful. This is just good business sense anyhow, but it's adding that extra layer of oversight and double checking, I think, makes a big difference.
I'm sort of using that because I know that, William Blair was one of the first to have a broker or security license in both US and Japan, which is a very, very tedious process, I'm assuming.
It is,
Yeah.
but it's, again, as I look at the process that is required here in the U.S., it's not very different than setting up over in Japan. It's some of the same issues you have to jump through. In terms of the tediousness of it, a lot of it is simply understanding there's always slight variations from what you're used to here in the States. And if my immediate boss was actually Swiss, but he didn't have any experience really in terms of setting up an office outside of the US. So our senior management was only familiar with US standards and not familiar with Japanese standards. So it took some time to explain that to them. But they were flexible. They were willing to understand that just because it's done a certain way here in the U.S. doesn't mean that's the only way it can be done anywhere in the world. And I think that helped a lot in making sure that the setting up was straightforward. The complication, as you point out, we were the first foreign firm with a dual investment advisory broker-dealer license, which, in case you're wondering what that is, investment advisory means we could advise pension plans on how to invest or advise on pools of money. And broker-dealer was simply, executing trades. So that kind of dual licenseship was, we were the first foreign firm, and then after that, other firms followed us. But that was also a challenge for the Japanese regulators. We wanted to do that, and they were like, well, we don't have that construct, but we're willing to consider it. And so we went back and forth. My former employer, Tokyo Mitsubishi, actually set up the very first one, and because they set up the very first one just a few months before us, that helped us get the license eventually to do the same thing.
So now you basically understand, or your company understands, the process, what they need to do, the corporate registrations,
Yes.
how you're sort of applying your license. You get into Japan, hiring,
Yes.
finding people, employment, sometimes might be a hard task for a lot of foreign companies, especially if you're a foreign company and you're looking for bilingual employees. How did that fare for you guys?
That's a great point. I mean, hiring good people is always the most difficult thing for any corporation, whether you're in the U.S. or here in Japan. And I think the same hurdles are everyone encounters the same hurdles. In other words, people want to work for prestigious companies. Of course, they want the best pay and they want the shortest hours. That's human nature. If you are not a well-known company, you have to find a way to become better known or to be connected with the people that might be able to help your company grow. So my viewpoint was to ask my existing clients and some of my competitors, who should I be hiring? And, if you ask somebody in the right frame of mind, people are willing to help you, regardless of where you are in the world. And I found everybody that I asked very, very helpful. So people would say, well, you should hire this person. You should hire this one woman who's over here because has a reputation of having never made a mistake in 15 years. Well, sounds like somebody I want to hire. I ended up hiring her. Now, it took time. It takes time to hire good people, and especially if you're an unknown entity in a new country. And I would say the principles that would work here in the U.S. in a general basis would work over there as well, which is, you reach out to people that may know you and may know them and try to bring you together. You reach out to demonstrate that your company has integrity, that you follow certain rules, that you're going to be around for a while, that you're not simply a fly-by-night organization. And then you try to, once you bring these people in, you try to make sure that they're treated well, they're respected, their viewpoints are heard, and that they have an opportunity to see that there's a long-term growth path for them. So if you can do those things, I think you can recruit people, and then word gets around. And so once you bring a couple of key people in, then usually they're good at attracting other good people.
So you already had a good amount of network within Japan, pretty much so you can sort of call and ask and see, if there's anything open or if there's any availabilities and such. And that sort of helped.
That helped a lot. And I would say that, for any company thinking of going to Japan or really anywhere where you're going to open up a new office, I mean, the right way to do it, in my opinion, is to spend the time to take your time and do things thoroughly and take a step-by-step approach. Oftentimes, somebody up the corporate ladder doesn't have time. They have some other scheme in mind and they want things done immediately. If that happens, you just have to roll with it, I think. But if you're in a position to make those decisions and or influence that kind of judgment, the best way, in my opinion, is to take several years before you open up an office in Japan, travel there frequently, make sure that people know that you're serious about it, and make sure that they know that this is something that has long-term implications both for them and for you if everyone stays in touch. And if you can keep that momentum going over a period of quarters, a period of months leading to more than a year, then people will start to feel comfortable that they can trust you. And if they can trust you, they'll help you.
So then, from the trust aspect of it, as a manager, managing now a business in Japan, a foreign business. You
Yep.
have both, foreign employees and Japanese employees
Yes.
working under you in a new sort of, market. Was there a difference, or did you feel there was a difference trying to manage these, employees, and have them understand that, you're trying to help them build or to have a trust in that,
Yes.
the company will last. So what I'm saying is a lot of the times the Japanese workforce might not want to work for a foreign company because, who knows, they might not last. It might be only a year or two that they might survive and they might end up going back.
Yep.
And then these employees might have a tough time. So as a manager, how do you sort of, make sure that, they understand that, you're here to stay?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, it starts with some small things and it leads to some bigger things. So small things are giving them a voice in things that are happening, and making sure that the staff back in the home country are aware one-on-one and have direct contact with your Japanese colleagues. If they do that, then they start to see that there's a relationship building across multiple levels. I think, other things are fairly straightforward. If you actually get a nice office space and a nice address and they see it's a multi-year lease, that gives people a little bit of comfort that you're actually planning on staying. And if you take care with some of the things that matter to Japanese staff, I mean, these are things some of the things are cultural, things are just simply ways of doing business a little bit different. For example, some employees are going to be very sensitive about auspicious days and inauspicious days, as you may well know. Simply you have to be cognizant of those things and be flexible. But the key thing I think is just like anything, if they see that you have a reasonably good reputation among your peers in your industry, that helps a great deal, I think, to cementing the belief that you're going to be around for a while.
Reputation certainly is a key.
It helps a great deal, yeah.
It does. I think I've recently, as an example for JETRO's, one of their success cases, we've recently helped HubSpot enter Japan. They announced this earlier this year, but they had so many questions. I've worked with them throughout the year, and so many questions on culture and how to develop a good workforce that's able to manage the culture itself. It's very difficult. For instance, you can't just fire somebody in Japan. It's not allowed. It's against the law. It's a tough thing that you have to pay more just to fire somebody than to have them resign. Little things like that really matters. And I think they billing, contracts and billings, and those are some of if you have any comments on those, that'd be great. But
Well, contracts on buildings, I mean, one of the difficult things, and this again is pretty much everywhere in the world, I think, but is you can't get a bank account without an address. You can't get an address without a bank account. You can't get either without a guarantor. And so that's always a tricky kind of conundrum for people. I was fortunate because in my previous life, before I joined William Blair, I worked for a Japanese bank, now called Tokyo Mitsubishi MUFG. And one of the gentlemen that I dealt with over there happened to be at one of the real estate agents. And when we were looking at Class A real estate, he was like, I remember you. So he ended up being my guarantor for the lease that we got in Toranomon. So the point is, those relationships can help. I don't know how HubSpot's doing it. I mean, hopefully they have something that's deeper than that. But it is difficult, I think, if it's a large company like a HubSpot, which is trying to make a big splash and open up. There's a lot of things that have to happen, and it takes time for those things to come together.
I mean, as a decision maker, companies can take 5 years to enter the market. It could take, they can just set up an office and start business because they have partners. I mean, how do you determine that point where it's like we're ready to go in, or how do you, sort of going back to previous questions, but what makes the decision, like the timing? You know that it constantly changes, the market constantly changes. You might have missed that opportunity. It's a tough question.
Yeah.
But, is there like is there a timing or is there a way to strategy towards that?
I mean, there's the ideal timing, of course, which is everything aligns. You've got all those important things lined up, and you've taken your time, and you've done your work, and people realize you have a differentiated product or service that truly is different when it comes to Japan. But I think, unfortunately, the reality for most probably American companies is somebody up top just gets the whim and says, go open up an office, and thinks that things are going to be immediately successful. So as long as that person who says go over and open up the office has the patience to understand that things take time before they actually gestate into profitable business, then I think that makes sense. But again, I would think it depends on the industry. It depends on the company. I don't know how much infrastructure HubSpot needs. We use HubSpot, by the way, at my firm, or we have used it. So very good product. In case anybody from HubSpot's in the room. So I'm sure they probably already have some visibility in Japan before they act over there. And I would think that's the primary reason most companies want to do that, right? Somebody from Japan reaches out, says, hey, this is interesting. They get the bug, and then they move from there.
And I guess it is similar to sort of taking the same step to open other offices as well. Is it very similar? I mean, did you see the similarity in opening in other countries as well? I mean, and in Japan, a lot of the times people might set up an office in Japan, might want to expand out into other parts of Asia from Japan. But then again, there are some companies that are in Asia, in other parts of Asia,
yes,
and essentially want to come to Japan. I mean, is there a difference, or do you think there's a difference in that?
That's a great point. I mean, there's a tendency on this side of the pond to just think of Asia and think, oh, it's kind of going from Boston to New York. But of course, as I'm guessing, most, if not all of you well know, a trip from Tokyo to Sydney is a long, long trip. And it's quite a bit different than going from Boston to New York. And I'd say the same applies for doing business in those other areas. I've both in the current company and in previous companies, I've done business in other parts of Asia, and I would say, there's the great differences and the great gaps and the issues of going from one country to the other country make it not a logical thing to think that you can just do business from another Asian base. That's my personal viewpoint. But I also think, when you think about the magnitude, Japan is still the world's third largest economy, and it's its own ecosystem. And if a company is in other parts of Asia and they are thinking about doing it in Japan, to me, the only right way to do it is in a dedicated way with a real office and real staff and a long-term commitment.
Thanks.
Sure.
Any questions in terms of this part of the section where I'd sort of say, regarding how a company goes into Japan? If there's any questions on it?
Yes, Nadia. Yes.
In your experience, especially when it comes to Japan, can you think of a personal situation that taught you a great lesson about how doing business in Japan works, especially when you talk to patients, understanding cultural differences?
Great question. So I'll leave the names off to protect the guilty and the innocent. I was in Japan, and one bank, we had opened up our office. One bank had promised to do business with us for a long, long time and had sent us an order. We had filled it, and it was a sizable, very profitable piece of business for us. And they had sent an Excel spreadsheet, and they asked us to fill all the boxes in there. And then, of course, we had to reconcile and make sure that everything was accurate. Well, we did that, and we found 1 penny difference. And first, my staff in the U.S. went through it. Two women went through it, detailed fine-tooth comb, went through the whole Excel spreadsheet, looking for that mistake. Where was that mistake? Checking, double checking against the paper confirmations for our trades. They couldn't find it. Then all of my staff in the Tokyo office, all 12, we dropped everything. I said, everybody, let's focus on this. Let's try to find this mistake. It was only 1 penny, but it mattered. So we went through everything. We're finding. Meanwhile, the customer is calling us. Hey, where's that document? We need that document. We have internal processes here we have to go through. And time is ticking by. So this started first at about 6 a.m., and now it's like 9:30, and the client is getting more and more upset. Finally, about like almost 10 o'clock, we finally found out that there was a macro in the Excel spreadsheet that rounded our numbers up. And so it tipped something over just a little bit to make that penny difference. We corrected that. We sent it back. We apologized, but they were very upset, and it had caused a lot of other problems within their bank. So we had to go back and we had to apologize, and there's a process that you have to go through. The long and short of that story is how important 1 penny can be for your business. Now, that client put us on a temporary suspension of business for the next 6 months. So that 1 penny was a very, very costly mistake. But it just goes to show, sometimes it's the unforeseen things that can slow you up. And, maybe if we had gone through all the macros and made sure that they were not rounded to 8 figures, but they were only rounded to 2 figures, we wouldn't have had that problem. So it's another example how, I think Japanese customers are used to a very high quality, a very high standard of quality. And so to compete successfully in Japan, one has to match or in reality exceed what those expectations are. And that is the difficult part about doing business in Japan. But that just makes you a better supplier or vendor anywhere else in the world. So thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, sorry. Sure. Yep.
So my question is twofold. In your case, in hiring Japanese employees, did you go for permanent or temporary employees? And then moving forward, what would your recommendation to foreign companies entering Japan be? Because I think it's a big factor.
It's a big factor. I mean, we thought about it, but we were a small group. I mean, with 12 Japanese staff, to have temporary and permanent employees among 12 people seemed to us too divisive. And so we went with permanent employees across the board. I did hire, before we actually had a full open office, I did have one temporary staff, and she was just basically a translator, translating documents for us. But my recommendation is, especially if we talk about commitment and whether you want to be there full time, is you hire full-time staff. Now, as Daiki pointed out, you can't just hire and fire in Japan. I mean, you can, but there's a cost to that, and there's a reputational cost as well as a financial cost. And sometimes there are regulations, specific regulations, that you can't simply willy-nilly fire people. So, but again, if you're there, if you're really committed there, if you've got a real 5-year plan and your management's really willing to bite the bullet for several years while you get to a profitable level, then I think it's worth it all the way around. Because in 5 years, you'll have dedicated staff that have been there, that know how everything works, and will represent your company. So.
Anything else? Any other questions? Okay. Sort of moving on.
Sure.
Kind of changing a little bit to the subject a little bit. The U.S., startup is big. A lot of new venture companies.
Yep.
You've been in the venture business slightly as yourself. In Japan, it's still something new. As a finance person, do you have any comments on that? Also, recently, if you don't know, SoftBank announced a massive venture fund, I believe with the Saudi Arabians, $100 billion fund, which is just an insane amount of money.
Yes.
And it seems like Japan is sort of trying to lead into this whole new, technology funding purpose, I guess, finding new things. But any comments from your end?
Well, I think, first of all, people, and maybe most of you are already well aware, and it's great that you brought up Masayoshi Son, because Masayoshi Son is a classic example of an entrepreneur that's done very, very well for himself. And Japan has a whole string of very successful startups. I mean, fast retailing is one of them, as you all know. If you've seen the Muji stores, then you know what I'm talking about. In my personal viewpoint, there's a lot of entrepreneurship in Japan, and there's a great history of entrepreneurship. People don't realize this. One of my former professors has written a great paper about venture capital in Japan in the 17th and 18th centuries. So if you're interested, I mean, there's a history of capital formation and lending to novel and novice businesses. The other thing that I think a lot of individuals outside of Japan do not realize is how many very old companies exist in Japan. What I mean by that is Japan has the largest number of entrepreneurial companies that have been around for more than 500 years. This is documented. So if you Google oldest company in the world, you'll see that it's a ryokan in Japan, an inn in Japan that's been in the same family for more than 46 generations or something like that. So Japan has a history of entrepreneurship, number one. Number two, that entrepreneurship is both historical and current. And number three is there are plenty of really interesting and novel ideas in Japan right now, in my opinion. As Daiki pointed out, I'm in the private equity business, but on the side of it, I'm not directly involved in the investing in startups. But I have invested in startups, including in Japan, and I can tell you that first of all, Japan is a great laboratory for new businesses because you have great infrastructure, you have high standards that are equal to or better than standards you'd find in other geographies. So if you can survive in that environment, I think you can take whatever you've created and transport that outside to other markets. But again, that's just my viewpoint on that.
And then also, given the economy situation right now, I mean, well, one other thing is this whole new casino deals going on right now, right? So it's an interesting aspect of it. But what's interesting to me is that given that I do foreign direct investment, right? We're seeing a lot of, good inquiries. We're seeing that, it seems like companies are positive looking into the Japanese market, because Japan is sort of opening up a little by little in terms of new reforms in healthcare, energy, IT, wrapping up the Tokyo Olympics. So it seems like there's going to be a little bit more, future businesses from the foreign side, from the foreign aspect. And we also see that as well. We see it from China. China's FDF, FDF from China is growing. FDF from Europe is growing. The U.S. is sort of stable, but always, U.S. has been in Japan for hundreds of years. Johnson & Johnson, GE, Citigroup, they've been there for ages. But at the same time, in the financial institution side, the investors or the institutional investors, they're leaving Japan, right? They're selling off.
Well, there's that perception.
It's very interesting, the balance of what's going on.
So that's a very interesting perception, and I'd say that's maybe for the public markets. I can tell you for our Cambridge associates, our clients certainly are not leaving Japan, heavily invested in Japan. And I would say for some of the venture firms that we track, I was just looking at the stats just the other day, the venture firms that we track have made over the last 10 years something like 540 some different direct investments into entrepreneurial companies in Japan. So I think maybe at the public equity level, the stock market back and forth, you see an ebb and flow of investors in and out of Japan. But the larger institutions, those who are not the quick money, the stable kind of investors, Those, I think, are in Japan and plan to stay in Japan for some time. On the periphery, I know there's always some media commentary about, Japan being, whether Abenomics is dead or whether it's revitalized. I would simply say there's plenty of examples of foreign entrepreneurs in Japan. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen the book Saying Yes to Japan, written by a couple of good friends of mine, so a little bit of a bias here. Carl Kay, who's actually a Harvard graduate, and his colleague Tim, his name escapes me at the moment, but he's a professor in Oregon. But the net is, if you read that book, you would see that there's all kinds of foreign entrepreneurs that have gone to Japan, set up operations in healthcare, in education, in finance, across the board. And in fact, quite a few of them have been there now for decades and still thriving.
Interesting aspect. And I know you've done a lot of talks in terms of Abenomics and
Sure.
other areas as well. And like you said, you don't know if it's working or if it's not working, or it's a tough.
I'm a little biased. I personally think it's
working.
it's working. It's all a matter of perception from the outside. I mean, all we have to do is look at a couple of key metrics. I mean, a couple of really big things that I don't think get a lot of publicity outside of Japan. Tourism, which you brought up just a second ago. I mean, the numbers are off the charts, which in some ways, for those of us who have lived or visited to Japan, is not a surprise. I mean, it's the level of service that you receive when you go into any kind of service establishment in Japan is off the charts. There's no comparable level of service anywhere else in the world, in my opinion. So to me, that's no surprise that tourists are beating a path to Japan. I think the surprise is that they haven't done it earlier. I think leading up to the Olympics in 2020 in Tokyo, I think that will continue to grow. But other things that haven't gotten a lot of attention in the press are, for example, the big breakup of the kind of 10 corporate kind of utility monopoly in Japan, which has just recently been broken up. And now you have these new combinations. For example, SoftBank is involved with one of them, as you well know. And that is a real positive, I think, for Japan and for the world, because that means electrical costs and those infrastructure costs for business or for residents are going to go down. You have a number of other developments. There was an ombudsman set up for that, who is an appeal to make sure that things are done the right way. There are a whole bunch of these little structural implements that are not really being discussed right now in the broader press, which I think is a mistake. So I'd say that, just like any kind of set of reforms, this was an incredibly ambitious plan. And sure, there's kinks to this. There's always going to be a negative perception of anything when, the stock market goes down or there's some other, collateral around that. But I mean, I'd say it's too early to say it hasn't worked. And I'd say other evidence is pointing to at least some of those structural reforms working.
Thanks very much for that.
My pleasure.
I think time is somewhat running out, but
Sure.
One other question. When working with Japanese companies, when dealing with these Japanese companies, how do you prepare for that? Or working with your experiences working with the Japanese side, any preparations, any advices for the audience?
Well, I'd say I'd say the principles of good business apply everywhere, right? And that means, be courteous, be thorough, do your homework, prepare in advance. If you do those things, I think everything works out in the end. I don't think you necessarily have to read every book on Japan or study Japanese. That helps. That's a step in the right direction. It shows a greater commitment. But at the end of the day, I think one of the great things about doing business with Japan is you don't necessarily have to speak Japanese to be successful there. I know plenty of people who barely have a word of Japanese and yet have made long-term careers over there and are well regarded by their Japanese colleagues and clients. So I'd say It would certainly be a step in the right direction. But if you truly have a differentiated product or service, and doesn't exist in Japan, and you are crossing your T's and dotting your I's, and are careful about doing the right thing, you'll be successful in Japan.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Any final questions?
What's the next step for you in Japan with the business?
Well, for my firm, my current firm that I work for does not have an office in Japan. And so I'm pushing actually for them to open up an office in Japan. So I'm a little biased on many fronts here. But thank you, Nadia. Oh, yes. Sure. Oh, that's a great question. I go back to Japan fairly regularly, a couple times a year. Every time I get off the plane at Narita, I feel like saying, "Tadaima, I'm home." It's the food, it's the attentiveness, it's the exacting self-standards that a lot of Japanese have. Those are things I miss. But I have a lot of friends there too. So I guess I can say I miss them, but it's not quite the same thing. But the point is, it's the total combination of things. You just came back from Japan. I'm sure you're missing those things already. I'm sure it was, yes. Well, I envy you the fact. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Okay.
All right, great. Well,
Thank
thank you
you
very much, Dave.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Daiki. Appreciate it.